There's a moment that changes everything in a relationship. It's not the moment of connection, nor the height of intimacy. It's not even the first serious conflict. It's the moment when you finally decide to walk away, truly walk away, without looking back, without second guessing, without the hidden hope of being pursued. You've experienced this moment, haven't you? Perhaps with a romantic partner who took you for granted once too often, or with a friendship that drained more than it nourished. Maybe with a family member whose toxicity you finally acknowledged, or even with an entire social circle that no longer aligned with who you'd become. But what if I told you that when you walk away, you trigger a profound psychological cascade in those you leave behind? A sequence of emotional and cognitive responses so powerful that Carl Jung, one of history's greatest psychological minds, identified it as a critical catalyst for either profound transformation or deep entrenchment in the other person. Most people believe that walking away simply creates absence. But Jung discovered something far more significant. Your departure doesn't create a vacuum, it creates a mirror. And what people see in that mirror reveals more about their authentic selves than perhaps anything else could. This video isn't about manipulation tactics or revenge strategies. It's about understanding the deep psychological processes that unfold when you choose yourself over a connection that no longer serves you. When you finally honour your worth enough to walk away from what diminishes it. Today, I'm going to reveal the 6 psychological phases people experience when you walk away, according to Jung's theoretical framework. And by the end, you'll understand not just the impact of your absence, but the profound power of conscious withdrawal as a catalyst for both your growth and potentially theirs. In this video, I'll explain Jung's insights on the psychology of separation, the 6 stages people experience when you walk away, and how understanding this process can transform your approach to relationships that no longer serve your authentic development. Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, spent decades exploring the dynamics of human relationships and their role in psychological development. While Jung never labeled these specific stages of abandonment response, his writings on projection, individuation, and the shadow provide a profound framework for understanding what happens in the psyche of those left behind. I've spent years studying not just Jung's original texts, but also how contemporary psychological research has validated and expanded his insights. I've observed these patterns unfold in hundreds of relationships, and the consistency of the response sequence is remarkable. Regardless of whether we're talking about romantic partnerships, friendships, family dynamics, or even professional connections. Before we begin, let's clarify something important. This exploration isn't about encouraging you to walk away from relationships capriciously or using separation as a manipulation tactic. Jung saw authentic separation as a sometimes necessary step in what he called the individuation process, the journey toward becoming your true self. Walking away becomes necessary when a relationship actively impedes that journey. What's most fascinating about Jung's perspective is that he understood separation not as the end of a psychological relationship, but often as the beginning of its most significant phase. When physical proximity ends, the psychological relationship often intensifies in ways that reveal truths that were hidden during active engagement. Now, let's explore the first and perhaps most immediate response that Jung's framework helps us understand when you choose to walk away. When you first walk away from someone who believed you would always stay, regardless of how they treated you or what they did, their initial response rarely reflects their deepest feelings. Instead, what emerges is a psychological defense mechanism that Jung identified as central to the ego's self-preservation: denial. The person you've left behind enters what we might call the disbelief phase. On the surface, this manifests as shock, confusion, or even amusement, as if your decision couldn't possibly be serious or permanent. They'll be back, they think. This is just temporary, they assure themselves and others. This isn't simple optimism, it's a complex psychological defense. Jung understood that the human mind automatically protects itself from information that threatens its established self-concept. For someone who believed they were essential to you, your departure creates cognitive dissonance, a psychological state where their beliefs about reality clash with the new reality you've created by leaving. In Jung's framework, this denial serves a critical psychological function. It buys time. The psyche needs to gradually adjust to significant changes rather than absorbing them all at once. The disbelief phase allows the person's unconscious mind to begin processing what the conscious mind isn't yet ready to accept. What makes this phase particularly interesting is what's happening beneath the surface denial. While consciously dismissing the significance of your departure, the person is unconsciously beginning to register the change. This creates what Jung would call psychological tension, an energetic state that will eventually demand resolution. The length of the disbelief phase varies significantly based on several factors: the person's psychological flexibility, their history with abandonment or loss, and most importantly, the role you played in their identity structure. The more central you were to how they define themselves, the longer and more intense this initial disbelief tends to be. During this phase, the person often maintains a facade of indifference or even relief. They might tell mutual friends they're actually glad it's over, or that they saw this coming and it's for the best. But Jung would recognize these statements as what he called compensatory reactions, conscious attitudes that develop precisely to balance the opposite feeling emerging from the unconscious. What they're not yet showing, perhaps not even to themselves, is the emotional wound that's beginning to form beneath their shield of denial. This wound will become increasingly difficult to ignore as the disbelief phase gradually gives way to the next stage of the separation response. The clearest indicator that someone is in the disbelief phase is a contradictory behavioural pattern. They declare disinterest in your return while simultaneously creating opportunities for re-engagement. They might accidentally call you, appear in places you frequent, or reach out to mutual connections to gather information about you. These behaviours betray the unconscious recognition of a significance their conscious mind isn't yet ready to acknowledge. But as days pass and your absence persists, the protective bubble of disbelief becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Reality begins to penetrate their defences, and when it does, the person moves into the second phase of the separation response, one that Jung would recognise as a crucial moment of psychological reckoning. Once the initial shock fades and reality begins to penetrate the shield of denial, the person enters what we might call the replacement endeavour. This is when they attempt to quickly fill the void your absence has created, often with remarkable urgency and minimal discretion. Jung would recognise this behaviour as an unconscious attempt to prove a specific narrative, that your presence wasn't uniquely valuable, that the connection you shared wasn't irreplaceable, and most importantly, that they remain worthy of attachment despite your decision to leave. This phase manifests in several distinct patterns. The first is immediate rebound relationships or friendships. The person rapidly establishes new connections that often superficially resemble what they shared with you. They might even choose someone who looks similar to you, shares your interests, or occupies a similar social position. Jung would see this as archetype projection. They're not relating to the new person as an individual, but as a container for the psychological role you once filled. The second pattern is what modern psychologists call the identical replacement. They find someone who seems to offer the same qualities or benefits you provided, but without the complications or demands. This replacement often receives excessive praise and idealization, not because they're actually superior, but because idealizing them helps sustain the narrative that leaving was your mistake, not their loss. The third pattern is conspicuous prosperity, a sudden increase in outward displays of happiness, success, or fulfillment. This might manifest as an explosion of social media activity, showcasing how wonderful life is post-separation, new material acquisitions, or dramatic life changes like moving cities or changing careers. Jung would recognize this as compensatory behavior, external actions designed to balance internal feelings of loss or rejection. What makes the replacement endeavour so fascinating from Jung's perspective is that it reveals the person's unconscious understanding of exactly what they've lost. The specific aspects of you they rush to replace are precisely the aspects they valued most, though they may not consciously recognise this connection. A social media influencer who participated in a study on post-relationship behaviour patterns described this phenomenon perfectly. I found myself frantically dating men who were intellectual like my ex. I told everyone I was having the time of my life, but I wasn't attracted to any of them. I just needed to prove I could still access what he had given me. Jung would view this phase as psychologically necessary but ultimately futile. The person is attempting to address an internal psychological wound with external solutions, what he called misplaced concretism, the confusion of inner psychological needs with outer circumstances. The replacement endeavour typically lasts until the person exhausts themselves with the effort of maintaining this compensatory behaviour, or until they're forced to confront the reality that external replacements aren't resolving their internal discomfort. When this recognition occurs, they enter the third and often most volatile phase of the separation response. After the denial fades and the replacement efforts fall short, the psychological defences that held deeper emotions at bay begin to crumble. What emerges is what we might call the emotional eruption, a phase characterised by the sudden, often overwhelming surfacing of feelings that were previously suppressed. Jung understood emotions not as simple reactions, but as complex energetic responses that demand expression. When denied conscious acknowledgement, emotional energy doesn't disappear. It accumulates in the unconscious, building pressure until it can no longer be contained. This eruption is the psychological equivalent of a dam breaking after too much pressure is built behind it. The emotional eruption typically manifests in three distinct patterns. The first is anger, often appearing as seemingly disproportionate rage or resentment. The person might suddenly vilify you, rewrite the relationship history to cast you as the villain, or engage in unexpected acts of hostility. Jung would recognize this as shadow projection, the unconscious attribution of disowned aspects of the self onto another. The person isn't just angry at you for leaving, they're angry at themselves for caring that you did, for being vulnerable to loss, for possibly deserving the abandonment. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that the intensity of post-separation hostility correlates not with the terms of the separation itself, but with the degree to which the person's self-concept was invested in the relationship. The more central you were to their identity, the more threatening your departure, and consequently, the more intense the emotional backlash. The second pattern is profound sadness or depression. The full weight of the loss finally registers, often with an intensity that seems delayed or even displaced in time. Jung would describe this as encountering the shadow, facing the vulnerable, dependent aspects of oneself that were previously denied. This confrontation with vulnerability can be so uncomfortable that the person oscillates between sadness and anger, unable to settle in either state for long. The third pattern is what contemporary psychologists call emotional flooding, a state where multiple strong emotions cycle rapidly, creating confusion and psychological disorientation. The person might feel intense longing one moment, bitter resentment the next, followed by guilt, shame, relief, and fear in quick succession. Jung would see this as the psyche's attempt to process complex emotional material that had been denied expression during the relationship. What makes the emotional eruption particularly significant is that it often marks the first authentic emotional response to your departure. The denial and compensatory behaviours were psychological shields. This eruption represents what Jung would call psychological truth, the genuine emotional reality that was present but unacknowledged. For those witnessing this phase from the outside, the emotional intensity often seems excessive or delayed. Why are they so upset now, weeks after claiming they were fine? This apparent contradiction makes perfect sense through Jung's understanding of psychological dynamics. Authentic emotional processing can only begin once the defensive structures have been exhausted. The length and intensity of the emotional eruption vary widely based on the person's emotional capacity, their history with expressing difficult feelings, and the depth of the attachment that was severed. What remains consistent is that this phase represents a critical juncture in their response to your departure, a psychological crossroads where authentic transformation becomes possible. As the emotional storm gradually exhausts itself, the person moves into the fourth phase of the separation response, one that Jung would recognize as essential to either psychological growth or entrenchment. As the emotional intensity begins to stabilize, the person enters what we might call the meaning-making attempt, a phase characterized by the drive to create a coherent narrative about what happened, why it happened, and what it means about both you and them. Jung saw meaning-making as a fundamental human need. We cannot simply experience significant events, we must integrate them into our understanding of ourselves and the world. Your departure creates what Jung would call a psychological wound that demands interpretation. The person must make sense of this wound to determine how to relate to it. The meaning-making attempt manifests in several distinctive ways. The first is the creation of what psychologists call a self-protective narrative, a story that minimizes both the significance of the relationship and the impact of its ending. It was never really that good, they might tell themselves. I was outgrowing them anyway. This is actually a blessing in disguise. Jung would recognize these as compensatory stories designed to protect the ego from the full impact of the loss. The second manifestation is the character assassination narrative, a story that focuses on your flaws, mistakes, or shortcomings as the comprehensive explanation for the relationship's end. This narrative often involves significant distortion or selective attention. Relatively minor issues become defining characteristics. Positive attributes are forgotten or reframed as manipulations. Jung would see this as a projection of the shadow, attributing the cause of pain entirely to external factors to avoid confronting internal contributions. The third and most psychologically significant manifestation is what Jung would call authentic introspection, a genuine attempt to understand one's role in the relationship dynamic and its dissolution. This manifests as honest questions rather than definitive conclusions. What was my part in this? What can I learn from this experience? How might I grow from this loss? This form of meaning-making represents the potential for what Jung called individuation, psychological development through the integration of difficult experiences. A fascinating study from the University of California examined narrative development after relationship dissolution and found that the type of story people created predicted their psychological adjustment 2 years later with remarkable accuracy. Those who created narratives acknowledging both external and internal factors, a balanced perspective, showed significantly better emotional outcomes than those whose stories placed blame exclusively on either themselves or the other person. What makes the meaning-making attempt so pivotal is that it establishes the foundation for either psychological growth or stagnation. The narrative the person constructs will largely determine whether your departure becomes an opportunity for development or a wound that hardens into bitterness. For those capable of authentic introspection, this phase can be transformative, leading to genuine insights about relationship patterns, unacknowledged needs, and opportunities for growth. For those who cannot bear this level of self-examination, the phase typically results in rigid narratives that protect the ego but prevent learning. As the narrative solidifies, the person moves into the fifth phase of the separation response, one that Jung would recognize as revealing perhaps the most profound truth about the relationship and its significance. After creating a narrative to explain your departure, the person enters what we might call the return strategy phase, a period where they develop an approach to either re-establish connection or permanently close the door on the relationship. What makes this phase particularly revealing from Jung's perspective is that it often directly contradicts the narrative created during the meaning-making attempt. Someone who constructed a story about how the relationship was never that important may nevertheless develop elaborate plans to re-enter your life. Conversely, someone who acknowledged the relationship's significance might still choose definitive closure. This contradiction reveals what Jung would call the difference between the persona, the conscious self-presentation, and the shadow, the unconscious reality. The return strategy often emerges from deeper psychological truths than the conscious narrative acknowledges. The return strategy typically manifests in one of three patterns. The first is what contemporary psychologists call strategic vulnerability, a carefully calibrated approach that combines authentic emotion with calculated timing and delivery. The person reaches out with what appears to be raw honesty, but the presentation is deliberately designed to maximize the chance of re-engagement. Jung would recognize this as a complex interplay between genuine feeling and manipulative intent, often occurring without full conscious awareness of the manipulation. A clinical psychologist specializing in relationship patterns described this phenomenon. My clients often believe they're being completely authentic in these reconnection attempts, but when we explore the careful planning behind their seemingly spontaneous messages, they begin to recognize the strategic element of their vulnerability. The second pattern is the life demonstration, an indirect approach where the person showcases changes, improvements, or transformations they believe would address the issues that led to your departure. This might involve visible self-improvement, public acknowledgement of past mistakes, or demonstrative changes to life circumstances. Rather than directly asking to reconnect, this strategy aims to inspire you to initiate the reconnection based on evidence of change. The third pattern is what Jung would recognize as genuine closure, an authentic acceptance of the relationship's end that seeks neither reconnection nor revenge, but simply acknowledgement and, when appropriate, reconciliation without expectation of resuming the former connection. This manifests as communication that expresses gratitude, acknowledges both positive and difficult aspects of the shared experience, and wishes well without hidden agenda. What makes the return strategy so psychologically significant is that it reveals the true meaning the person has assigned to your departure. Regardless of the narrative they've constructed, their actions in this phase show what Jung would call their psychological truth, the reality of how they've integrated the experience of losing you. Research from relationship psychology has found that the approach people take in potential reconciliation attempts correlates strongly with their attachment styles and core beliefs about self-worth. Those with secure attachment tend toward honest closure or authentic reconciliation attempts, while those with anxious attachment favor strategic vulnerability, and those with avoidant attachment often choose life demonstrations over direct communication as the return strategy plays out, whether through attempted reconnection or definitive closure. The person moves into the final phase of the separation response, one that Jung would see as revealing the ultimate psychological impact of your decision to walk away. The final phase in the psychological journey triggered by your departure is what we might call the integration outcome, the lasting way the person incorporates the experience of losing you into their understanding of themselves and their approach to future relationships. Jung saw integration as the ultimate goal of psychological development, the process by which experiences, even painful ones, become constructive elements of the psyche rather than unresolved wounds. The integration outcome reveals whether your departure has catalyzed growth or reinforced existing patterns. This phase manifests in three primary patterns. The first is transformative integration. The person uses the experience of losing you as a catalyst for genuine psychological development. They recognize patterns, acknowledge their contributions to the relationship's dynamic, and make conscious changes to their approach to connection. Jung would see this as successful individuation, psychological growth through the conscious assimilation of previously unconscious material. A longitudinal study tracking post-relationship development found that approximately 30% of people demonstrate this transformative pattern, showing measurable changes in attachment security, emotional regulation, and relationship satisfaction in subsequent connections. The second pattern is defensive entrenchment. The person calcifies around their existing patterns, but with added defensive layers. They become more guarded, more suspicious, or more controlling in subsequent relationships. Their narrative about your departure becomes a justification for these intensified defenses. This proves why I can't trust people, or this confirms what I've always known about relationships. Jung would see this as the reinforcement of the complex, the strengthening of psychological patterns that actually led to the relationship's dissolution. The third pattern is pendulum reaction. The person swings dramatically to the opposite extreme of whatever dynamic characterized their relationship with you. If they were overly dependent with you, they become fiercely independent in subsequent relationships. If they were controlling with you, they become excessively accommodating with others. Jung would recognize this as enantiodromia, the tendency of the psyche to move to the extreme opposite when a position becomes untenable, without finding true balance. What makes the integration outcome so significant is that it reveals the ultimate psychological impact of your decision to walk away. The question isn't simply whether the person misses you or wants you back, it's whether your absence has catalyzed authentic development or reinforced the very patterns that made separation necessary. Research in developmental psychology suggests that the primary determinant of the integration outcome isn't the nature of the relationship or even how it ended, but rather the person's capacity for what psychologists call mentalization, the ability to understand one's own mind and the minds of others. Those with stronger mentalization skills are significantly more likely to achieve transformative integration, regardless of the relationship's duration or intensity. For the person you've left behind, this final phase represents a profound psychological crossroads, a point where they either evolve beyond the patterns that contributed to your departure or become more entrenched in them. And while you cannot determine which path they take, understanding this process can help you recognize the true impact of your decision to walk away. We've explored the 6 psychological phases people typically experience when you choose to walk away: the disbelief phase, the replacement endeavor, the emotional eruption, the meaning-making attempt, the return strategy, and the integration outcome. Each phase reveals a different facet of the complex psychological journey triggered by your absence. 70. What Jung's perspective helps us understand is that walking away from a relationship that doesn't serve your authentic development isn't simply an act of separation, it's potentially an act of psychological catalysis. Your departure creates the conditions for either profound transformation or deeper entrenchment in the other person, depending on their capacity for authentic self-reflection. There's a certain paradox here that Jung would appreciate. Sometimes the most significant impact you have on someone isn't through your presence, but through your absence. When you're gone, the projections, expectations, and patterns that characterize the relationship are suddenly thrown into sharp relief, creating an opportunity for awareness that wasn't possible during active engagement. This understanding transforms how we might think about the decision to walk away. It's not merely about escaping a situation that doesn't serve us, though that's certainly valid in itself. It's about creating the psychological conditions that make genuine change possible, both for ourselves and potentially for the other person. The key insight from Jung's framework is that authentic connection cannot be forced or maintained through compromise of the self. True relationship emerges only between individuals engaged in their own journey of becoming. Sometimes walking away is the most honest acknowledgement that the current relationship dynamic prevents, rather than supports that journey. If this exploration has helped you understand your own experience of walking away or being left behind, write, "I choose authentic development" in the comments. Let's see how many people are committed to relationships that support genuine psychological growth, rather than mutual entrenchment. And don't forget to watch the next video in this series, where I'll explore the shadow dance in relationships, Jung's framework for understanding how unconscious material shapes our attractions, conflicts, and patterns of connection. Because understanding these dynamics is the first step toward creating relationships that support rather than impede your journey toward wholeness.